He hadn't asked for food. He hadn't asked for money. He hadn't asked for anything at all. He had stood at the gate of a failing ranch on a cold Colorado morning in the autumn of 1880, hat in both hands, and told an old woman he could already see 3 things wrong with her property from the road. He named them one by one. She hadn't said a word back to him. She just looked at his eyes, at the steadiness in them, the kind you don't learn from books or comfort, and turned to call for her husband. Her husband came to the door, took one look at the young man standing there with patched boots and a fresh cut on his cheekbone, and started shaking his head before the boy had finished speaking. The word no was already forming on that old rancher's lips. 64 years of hard living had taught him exactly what a drifter looked like, and the boy at his gate looked like one. And then, from the far pasture, the cattle started running. What that boy did in the next 20 minutes, and what he built in the months that followed, didn't just save the Coldwater Bend Ranch from a winter that would have finished it. It gave that old rancher back something he had buried in the frozen ground 2 years before, and thought he would never find again. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's ride. Colorado High Country, 1880, the kind of land that was beautiful and indifferent and demanded everything you had, and occasionally took more than that. Mara Whitcomb was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands when she saw the boy come around the bend in the road. He was on foot, no horse, no pack animal, nothing but a canvas bag that hung from one shoulder with the flat, modest weight of something that held very little. His coat was worn at both elbows, his boots showed daylight at the left sole, and there was a cut along his right cheekbone that was maybe 3 days old and hadn't been properly cleaned. His hair, dark brown and overlong beneath his hat, was the hair of a young man who had not recently been anywhere with a mirror that mattered. He was young, 20, maybe less, thin in the way that meant hungry, not built. But he wasn't stumbling, he wasn't hurrying. He moved with the particular economy of a person who has learned to spend only what they have, no more, no step wasted. And his eyes, when they came up from the road and found the ranch, didn't dart or calculate the way some men's eyes did. They moved slowly, the way you read something you intend to understand. Mara watched him look at the house, then at the barn, then at the distant movement of cattle in the far pasture. She watched him stop for just a moment and look at the fence line along the cottonwood stand to the west, at the section that had been leaning wrong for a month, and that Silas kept meaning to fix, and hadn't, because there was always something more urgent than the thing that hadn't broken yet. She had been wrong about men who came to this gate before. A man named Griggs had come 3 years back with a good story and left with their best saddle. A man named Pruett had worked 4 days, drunk through the 5th, and disappeared on the 6th with $30 from the tin above the stove. But Mara had a talent she had never entirely trusted and never entirely abandoned, reading people not by what they said first, but by where their eyes went when they looked at something. Griggs's eyes had gone to the barn, to what could be taken. Pruett's had moved with the restlessness of a man already planning his exit. This boy's eyes had gone to the fence. She set her coffee down and went to the door. Behind her, Silas sat with his ledger open and the expression he wore every morning when the numbers said things he didn't want to hear. The ledger was not good. They had come to this land 31 years ago and built everything on it: the house, the barn, the fence lines, the reputation. Their elder son Franklin was in Denver and not coming back. Their younger son Elias was in the ground on the rise behind the east pasture, taken by a winter fever at 19, 2 years past. After Elias, something had gone quiet in the house that used to be loud. The second voice at the breakfast table. The questions about the land, the spring questions, the pasture questions, the kind a young man asks when he is making a map of a place inside himself because he plans to stay. Those questions had stopped, and Silas had not known until they stopped how much of what kept him going had been answering them. The boy at the gate took his hat off when he reached the porch steps. Mara had opened the door before he knocked. She had learned to be already there rather than summoned, and she looked at him without speaking. "Ma'am." He held his hat in both hands. "I'm not here to beg. I can see you run cattle. Your west fence is sagging near the cottonwoods. Your lower trough is losing water. I can see the ground wet around it from here, and it shouldn't be, not in October, and your herd is too close to the draw for this time of year. Something gets in that brush after dark, and your cattle will scatter before you know they're moving." 3 problems. All real. All things she had mentioned to Silas, who had added them to the list of things he was getting to. "What is it you want?" she said. "Sleep in your barn," he said, "and I'll watch your cattle." She heard Silas push back from the table. He came to the door and stood at her shoulder, filling the frame, the way big men fill door frames, even when the years have taken something from the width of them. He looked at the boy the way he looked at weather, carefully, without hurry, taking full measure before committing to an opinion. "Where are you from?" Silas said. "Kansas, mostly." The boy's voice was even. "Been working ranches since I was 15. Working or drifting?" A pause, short and honest. "Some of both, sir." Silas's jaw moved. Mara knew that jaw. She had lived with it for 31 years. It moved that particular way when the answer was already decided and the man was simply working out how to deliver it without being rude about it. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. 31 years of marriage had made this its own language. She could read the whole conversation in 3 seconds of eye contact. He didn't want the boy. She wasn't saying yes. But she wasn't saying no either, and Silas could read that too, and he opened his mouth with the particular breath of a man whose decision is made. And then, from the west pasture, from behind the barn and over the low ridge, came the sound that every cattleman in that country knew and never wanted to hear at sundown. Not the restless lowing of a hungry herd, not the slow movement of cattle shifting in an evening pasture. This was different, tight, alarmed, directional, the sound cattle make when something has frightened them and they are already moving. The boy turned, before either of them had spoken a word. He looked toward the west fence line, toward the cottonwood stand, toward the section he had named when he was still 20 feet from the porch, and his whole body went quiet and focused in the way of someone who has stopped processing information and started acting on it. "Your herd is moving," he said. Calm, not performing calm, actually calm, the way an animal is calm when it has made a decision. West fence is down, and something's pushed them toward the draw. You've got less than 10 minutes before they hit the timber. I need a horse. Silas stared at him for 1 full second. Then he pointed at the barn. Chestnut gelding, near stall. The boy was already moving. He could ride. That was the first thing Mara understood, watching from the gate, while Silas moved toward the barn with a speed she hadn't seen from him in years. The boy had the chestnut out of the stall, and moving before he was fully in the saddle, handling the animal with the loose, natural confidence of someone for whom riding is not a skill that requires thought, but a language the body already speaks. He went over the ridge and out of sight. Silas climbed up on the fence rail beside her without speaking, and they stood and waited. The cattle sounds had moved north toward the timber, and then gradually, slowly, began to settle and reverse. 22 minutes after he had disappeared over the ridge, Tobin Hale came back, with the entire herd moving ahead of him in a compact, steady group, 34 head, not one missing, moving at the even pace of cattle that have been calmed rather than chased. Running the left flank was Moses, the Whitcombs' cattle dog, 3 years old, smart enough to be difficult, selective about whose instructions he followed. He had bitten 2 hired hands. He had once stood in the road and refused to move for Silas for 10 minutes over a disagreement Silas never understood. Moses was running that flank like he had worked with the boy for years. Tobin brought the herd into the north pasture, shut the gate behind the last steer, and rode back to where the Whitcombs were standing. He dismounted and held the reins out to Silas. 2 sections of the west fence are down, he said, not breathing hard. There's a section along the east edge too that's been pushed from the inside. One of your bulls has been testing it. I'd want to walk that fence line in the morning before you turn them back. Silas looked at his cattle, then at the boy, then at Mara. Mara said nothing. She didn't need to. Silas stood there for a long moment with his hands on the fence rail and the particular stillness of a man who has just had his no turned into a question he is not sure how to answer. "There's a room at the back of the barn," he said finally. "Mattress isn't worth much. Blankets thin." "I've slept colder," Tobin said. "Supper's at 6, Mara said. "We don't wait on it." "Yes, ma'am." She watched him lead the chestnut back to the barn. He untacked the animal properly, checked its feet before turning it out, brushed the sweat marks with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who has been taught that a horse is not equipment, but a thing that deserves care. Every step correct. Nothing showy. Just right. Moses sat at the barn door and watched all of this with what could only be described as approval. Mara turned and walked back to the kitchen. Behind her, she heard Silas take a slow breath. "I know," he said quietly. "You hadn't said anything yet," she said. "I didn't have to." In the weeks that followed, Tobin Hale proved useful in the way certain people are useful, not because they perform effort, but because they see what needs doing before anyone has to name it. He repaired the west fence, all of it, not just the section that had come down, walking every foot of the line with tools Silas lent him, and the patience of someone who understands that a fence is only as good as its weakest point. He rebuilt the lower trough with mortar he ground himself, properly set, so it would hold through freeze and thaw instead of cracking again in March. He found the weak point in the barn roof before the winter found it. He was good with the cattle, better than good. He had the quality that the best cattlemen have and cannot be taught, a stillness around animals, the ability to move through a herd the way weather moves through grass, without the grass knowing it has been moved. Silas watched him work the herd one morning from the far side of the fence and didn't say a word. But Mara saw her husband's face, and she knew what was on it, and she let herself think about it for only a moment before she made herself stop. Moses, for his part, had transferred his professional loyalties with a completeness that Mara found both gratifying and slightly insulting. He followed Tobin through the morning work like a shadow with opinions. He ran the fence checks beside him. He sat at Tobin's feet, at supper, as though the chair belonged to someone he had always been waiting for. Tobin came to supper at 6 every evening and was never late. He was quiet at the table, not sullen, but the quiet of someone who listens more than he speaks and saves his words for things worth saying. He asked about the land, where the water ran in spring, which pastures held through dry summers, where the herd sheltered in bad weather, whether Silas had ever thought about shifting the winter pasture south of the second ridge where the hill cut the worst wind. Silas answered him, every evening a little more, the way a man who has been keeping things to himself eventually finds a listener and realizes he has been waiting for one. These were not a temporary hands questions. They were the questions of someone building a map of a place from the inside, learning it the way you learn a person, by paying attention to what they tell you when they aren't trying to tell you anything. Mara noticed that her husband, for the first time since the winter of '78, had begun talking about the ranch in the future tense. Not the west fence needs mending, but next spring, the west fence. Small things. She noticed them all. November came, with the cold that in Colorado high country means business rather than suggestion. Silas's hands had slowed in cold weather for 2 years now, though neither of them had said so. Tobin worked in it the same as any other weather, steadily and without complaint, and the work got done. One evening, with the first snow moving down from the peaks and Silas's pipe going in the corner, Mara sat down across from Tobin after supper and said, "Tell me where you came from, not the ranch names, the before part." Silas looked up from his pipe. Tobin looked at the table for a moment. Then he told them. His mother had died when he was 8. His father had worked a small piece of ground in Kansas, 40 acres, a modest herd, a hay crop that was enough in good years. Tobin had worked alongside him from the time he could lift a fence post. When his father died, the land came to Tobin. He was 18 years old and believed, in the way that 18-year-olds believe things, that knowing the work was the same as knowing how to carry it. The herd got sick the following winter. He borrowed against the land to buy replacement stock and feed, and told himself he would recover by spring. Spring came, and the recovery was smaller than the debt. He borrowed again. He told himself the same thing. The spring after that, the bank came instead. He paused. The stove moved. The snow ticked against the window. They were not unkind about it, he said. That almost made it worse. They came with papers, and they took the land, and they said they were sorry, and I believe some of them meant it. He looked at his hands. I had $30 and what I could carry. I've been working since. But not staying, Mara said. He looked at her, not defensively, the way a person looks at someone who has said a true thing plainly. No, not staying. Why? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, a man who has lost his own land. I don't know if he has the right to put roots down in someone else's. I've been trying to figure out whether that's wisdom or cowardice. I haven't decided. The sitting room held that for a moment. Silas took his pipe out of his mouth and looked at it. He was quiet, in the particular way he was quiet when he was preparing to say something he had not said before. "You said roots like it was something you choose," he said. "Mostly it's something that happens to you, while you're busy doing other things." Tobin looked at him. Silas put his pipe back and said nothing else. But the words settled into the room and stayed there, the way words do when they are true. Amos Rusk arrived on a morning in late December with 2 men who wore their guns in the low, deliberate way of men paid to have them and want you to know it. Rusk himself was a heavy man in a good coat with the pink, well-fed face of someone whose hands had not seen honest work in a long while. He dealt in grain, in credit, in the gap between what desperate men needed and what he was prepared to offer. He had made a considerable living in that gap. He had come to the Coldwater Bend Ranch twice before. The first time, Silas told him the ranch was not for sale. The second time, Silas had made the same point with a rifle in the crook of his arm, which shortened the visit. He had calculated the Whitcombs carefully, the dead son, the one in Denver who wasn't coming back, the spring drought, Silas's age. What he did not know about was the boy in the barn. Tobin heard them from the hayloft, where he had been reinforcing the east beam that had begun to bow under the weight of 2 months' accumulated snow. He came down the ladder without hurrying and walked to the barn door and looked at the 3 horses at the gate with the same quiet assessment he turned on everything. Moses came to stand at his knee. Mara appeared from the house and crossed the yard to the barn. "Those men," Tobin said. "Who are they?" "The one in front has tried to buy this ranch twice," Mara said. "He wants the creek bottom. The south section, the one that holds water through winter when everything else around here is dry. It's the most valuable piece of ground Silas owns." Tobin watched Rusk sitting his horse at the gate, looking at the house with the expression of a man who has already decided how this visit ends. "Is Silas going to come out with the rifle," Tobin said, "and make this worse?" Mara's mouth moved at one corner. "He is thinking about it very seriously." "Go keep him in the house," Tobin said. He handed her the hammer he'd been carrying down from the hayloft. "Please." He walked to the gate without his rifle, without hurrying, without the rigid, braced posture of a man who is afraid but pretending not to be. He walked the way he walked everything, at his own pace, with his own weight, as though the ground beneath him was already his. Moses walked beside him. He stopped at the fence line, not at the gate, at the fence itself, on his side of it, standing where the boundary between what was Rusk's business and what was not was most clearly drawn. Rusk looked down at him from the saddle with the polite amusement of a man who considers young people a minor inconvenience to be moved around rather than engaged. "I'm here to speak with Silas Whitcomb," Rusk said. "Mr. Whitcomb isn't available this morning," Tobin said. His voice was even, not aggressive, not performing. "If you've got business with this ranch, you've got business with me. I'm Tobin Hale. I look after the Coldwater Bend herd." Rusk's pleasant expression held, but something behind it had shifted slightly. The way a man's expression shifts when a negotiation opens differently than he'd planned. "Son," Rusk said, and let the word carry the weight he intended it to carry. "I'm not here on business you'd have authority to speak to." "You're here about the ranch," Tobin said. "I have authority for that." One of the flanking men moved his horse half a step. Moses looked at that horse with an attention so total and so still that the horse noticed and didn't move again. "This property is struggling," Rusk said pleasantly. "I'm prepared to make a fair offer that would give Silas and his wife comfort in their later years." "The winter's going fine," Tobin said. "The note with the Morrow Bank is the Whitcomb's business," Tobin said, "not yours." He put both hands on the top fence rail, the gesture that in that country meant something specific about where a man stood and intended to keep standing. "You came here twice before. Both times the answer was no. The answer's the same this morning." Rusk's pleasantness thinned just enough to show what was underneath it. "That creek bottom will be worth considerably less to anyone if the operation around it fails to pay its debts," he said. "If it fails, that's between the Whitcombs and their banker." Tobin held Rusk's gaze. "There are 3 of you, and 1 of me at this fence. I don't have a gun, but there is a man on that porch with a rifle who has been looking for a reason to use it since the second time you came to this gate." He paused. "Do you want this creek bottom badly enough to bleed for it before breakfast?" The 2 flanking men looked at each other. They had professional experience in reading men across fence lines, and what they were reading in this young man, actually calm, not performing it, was something they had learned to take seriously. Rusk pulled his horse's head around. "This conversation isn't finished, Hale." "Come back in daylight," Tobin said. "On your own. I'll have coffee ready." Rusk rode away. Silas Whitcomb was standing on the porch with his rifle in the crook of his arm, and an expression Mara had not seen on his face in a very long time. The expression of a man who has just watched something he needed to see. That evening, Silas went to the back of the high shelf and brought down the good whiskey, the kind kept for things that warranted it. He poured 2 glasses and pushed one across to Tobin without asking. "You stood at that fence," Silas said. "Seemed like the place to stand. He would have come back worse if he'd seen any give." "I know." Silas turned his glass in his hand. The lamp burned between them. I'm 64 years old and I cannot work this land the way it wants working. I've known that since last spring. He set the glass down. A man like Rusk only comes back when he can smell someone getting tired. He won't smell it here, Tobin said. No. Silas looked at him. Not with you at the fence. He was quiet a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality. My boy used to ask the same questions you ask. Every evening. The water, the pasture, the fence lines, where to move the herd in March. He looked at the lamp. He was 19 when the fever took him. The kitchen was very still. I know, Tobin said quietly. I'm sorry. He would have been 21 this February. Silas was quiet for another moment. Then he set the glass down and looked directly at Tobin. I want to make you an offer, not a wages offer. Something different. Tobin waited. Finish this winter with us. Come spring, if you want to stay. If this place has become something you want to be part of, I'll draw up papers. 25% of this operation. Not wages. Ownership. Your name beside mine in the deed. He looked at Tobin steadily. In 10 years, when I can't run this the way it needs running, you'll have first right to buy the rest at a fair price. Not a desperation price, a fair one. Tobin looked at the table. Why? He said. Because you're good, Silas said. And because what you did at that fence tonight wasn't the act of a man working for wages, it was the act of a man defending something that mattered to him. He paused. And because this land needs someone who will love it, and I think you already do, whether you've said so to yourself or not. Tobin's eyes were wet. He did not look away from Silas, did not make any move to hide what was on his face. He let it be there, the way an honest person lets a true thing be visible, because hiding it would be a kind of lie. I'll earn it, he said. I know you will, Silas said. That's why I'm asking. The kitchen door opened and Mara came in from the sitting room with a third glass, which she set on the table and filled herself, because Silas had been forgetting to pour her a glass since roughly 1851, and this occasion did not appear to be any different. She sat down at the table and looked at the two of them and said, Well, now that's settled. And for the first time since he had come up that road with everything he owned in one canvas bag, Tobin Hale smiled. Not a polite smile, a real one. Rusk returned in January with a lawyer and documents, arriving in the manner of a man who had decided the first visit was simply a preliminary round. He found the ranch arranged differently than he'd left it. Tobin at the fence line, Silas at the barn door with his rifle, matter of fact about it, Mara on the porch, Moses at the fence post with the proprietary air of a dog who considers himself essential to the security of these particular acres. Coldwater Bend is not for sale, Tobin said. The ranch is in partnership proceedings with the county. Any future correspondence goes in writing to Mr. Harlan on the main street in town. Rusk looked past him at Silas. Silas looked back with 31 years of ownership on his face, and nothing left to prove. Rusk left. He did not come back that winter. The winter was hard. That part was true, and always would be. 3 weeks in February, when the temperature dropped to things men measured in gritted teeth rather than numbers. Water lines that froze and had to be thawed by hand each morning. Cattle penned close in the near pasture, checked twice a day. The barn in the mornings dark and cold, and smelling of hay and animal warmth, and 2 men working in it, their breath visible, the work requiring both of them. Silas noticed that Tobin worked in cold the same as every other weather. He noticed that the questions had not stopped, the spring questions, the pasture questions, but had shifted tense. Not where does the water run in spring, but when the water runs in spring, I'd want to move the herd south before the creek bottom gets soft. He noticed that Tobin had stopped saying your cattle and started saying the herd. He didn't mention it. He simply noted it, and went on, and found that the going on was easier than it had been in 2 years. Mara made the old recipes that winter. The ones she had put away after Elias, because some dishes were so much a part of certain evenings that making them alone felt like a wound. She set the table for 3 without thinking about it, and then thought about it, and decided that thinking about it too carefully served no one. She visited the grave on the east rise some evenings, as she always had. She went alone, and said the things that were between her and her son only. This was not a story about replacement. No one had been replaced. No person fills the space where another person was. What she understood, slowly and then all at once, was that grief does not leave. It learns, over time, to share the house with other things. With 2 men in the barn at first light. With Moses doing his rounds, with the self-importance of a dog who has found work worthy of his abilities. With supper at 6 that ran longer now, the conversation ranging across seasons and plans, the particular luxury of plans that reach past the next month. March came the way March comes in Colorado high country, reluctantly, arguing with February the whole way, giving ground inch by inch. The snowmelt started on the south faces first, the dark soil showing through in patches, and then the creek began to run free again under the last of the ice. And then one morning Tobin walked the west fence line that he had rebuilt in October, and found every post standing true and every wire holding, and stood there in the first real warmth of the season, and understood something he had not quite let himself understand until that moment. He was not leaving. He found Mara that evening on the fence rail above the south pasture, watching the cattle move through the new grass in the late light. He climbed up beside her. They sat without speaking for a while, the way 2 people sit when the silence between them has become comfortable rather than empty. "I wrote a letter," he said. "I saw the envelope. A girl I knew in Kansas, before." He was quiet a moment. "I don't know if she'll write back. I don't know if it was a foolish thing to do." "Why foolish?" "Because writing a letter is thinking about a future. I hadn't done much of that." Mara looked at the cattle moving in the long light below them, the fence line holding clean and straight, the water trough at the far end full and sound. "When Silas and I came to this land," she said, "we had a piece of paper and a piece of ground and nothing else. The first year, there were many days I thought we had made a terrible mistake. The second year, fewer. The third year, I stopped counting." She looked at the mountains, their peaks still carrying snow above the tree line. "But what we had, even in the first year, even on the worst days, we had somewhere to stop. After everything that came before, somewhere that was ours and needed us. That changes a person, Tobin." She paused. "Especially if they've gone a long time without it." He was quiet for a while. Moses appeared from somewhere and sat below them on the fence post in the grass, conducting his evening perimeter review with great seriousness. Below them, the cattle grazed through the new grass, slow and content. 34 head, not one missing. The creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, and would keep running through summer, when the country all around them dried, because it was good ground, and it was held, and it belonged to the people who understood what it was worth. "I think I'm starting to know what that feels like," Tobin said. He didn't say it like a man who has found an answer. He said it like a man who has found the beginning of one, and is surprised to discover that the beginning is enough. The drifting ends before you know it's ending. That is the truth of it. You don't feel the moment when the road stops being something you're following and starts being something you're leaving behind. You feel it later. Looking back at the country you've crossed, you see exactly where the ground changed beneath you, though you didn't feel it when it did. Tobin Hale came to the Coldwater Bend Ranch with patched boots and a canvas bag and nothing left of a life the bank had taken from him. He stood at a gate and told an old woman 3 things wrong with her property before she'd said a word to him. And she had looked at his eyes, at the steadiness in them, the kind that doesn't come from comfort, and opened the door before he knocked. You cannot replace what has been lost. Elias Whitcomb was in the ground, on the east rise, and that would always be true. No amount of spring grass or good whiskey or a young man asking the right questions changes an absolute thing. But grief, given enough time and enough grace, learns to share the house with other things. With the sound of 2 men in the barn before first light. With supper at 6 that runs longer now. With plans that reach past the next month. With a house that has found its footing again. Some people come into our lives not to fill a hole, but to show us that the ground around the hole can still grow things. The letter came back from Kansas in April, written in a careful hand. Mara left it on the table without reading it or asking about it. Tobin carried it in his pocket for 3 days before he mentioned it, with the expression of a man who is planning something for the first time in a long time, not ready to say it out loud yet, but able to feel the shape of it. That is what a future feels like, heavy and light at once, like something carried that doesn't weigh as much as you expected. If this story found something in you tonight, you know what to do. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I read every one. And if you haven't subscribed, come back. There is always another story on the road. I'll see you at the next one.